July 28, 1945, Manila Bay, Philippines, 14:30 hours. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Navy stood on the deck of an American auxiliary vessel, his hands bound, his uniform torn and stained with oil from the destroyer that had been his final command. 3 days earlier, his ship had been sunk by American aircraft. Now, as a prisoner of war, he was being transported to a processing center aboard what he assumed was a cargo vessel. But something was wrong. The ship smelled sweet. Not of fuel oil, not of ammunition, not of the diesel and sweat that permeated every Japanese warship he'd ever served on. This American vessel smelled like sugar and cream. As guards led him across the deck, Tanaka passed a line of American sailors. They weren't loading ammunition. They weren't manning guns. They were queuing at a serving window, laughing and joking, each receiving a cone of frozen dessert, ice cream, in the middle of the Pacific, on a warship, in July. His escort, a young American ensign who spoke passable Japanese, noticed his confusion. "That's the ice cream barge, Captain. She makes 10 gallons every 7 minutes. Been doing it since 1943. Tanaka stopped walking. The ensign had to gently push him forward. "You built a ship to make ice cream?" The American smiled. "We built several, actually. This one serves the fleet in Manila Bay. There's another in Ulithi, one in Pearl Harbor. Concrete hulls, refrigeration equipment, production capacity for thousands of gallons weekly." Tanaka had commanded ships for 15 years. He had studied at the Naval War College. He had read every intelligence report on American industrial capacity. He knew the statistics, the terrifying numbers of American ships, planes, and tanks. But nothing in his training, nothing in Japanese military doctrine, nothing in his understanding of war had prepared him for this moment. A nation that could build ships, entire ships, not to fight, not to transport, not to carry fuel or ammunition, but solely to manufacture frozen desserts for its sailors, had achieved something beyond military superiority. They had achieved abundance so complete that war itself had become a backdrop to comfort. This is the story of how American logistics transformed warfare, how ice cream became a symbol of industrial dominance, and how Japanese commanders, trained in the samurai tradition of sacrifice and austerity, confronted an enemy whose power was measured not just in battleships and bombers, but in the casual luxury it provided to its warriors. The mathematics of American abundance were written in sugar and cream, in refrigeration units and production lines, in the simple, devastating fact that while Japanese soldiers starved on Pacific islands, American sailors enjoyed ice cream socials on ships designed for no other purpose. By July 1945, when Captain Tanaka stood on that ice cream barge in Manila Bay, Japan had already lost the war. But the loss wasn't just military. It was philosophical, spiritual, total. They had fought the wrong enemy. Not because American soldiers were braver. Japanese troops had proven their courage countless times. Not because American tactics were superior. Japanese naval aviation had dominated early in the war. They had fought an enemy whose industrial capacity was so vast, whose resources were so unlimited, whose approach to war was so fundamentally different that Japan never stood a chance. And they learned this truth from ice cream. In December 1941, when Imperial Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Japanese military planners understood they faced a larger industrial opponent. Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington, warned that Japan could win battles for 6 months, perhaps a year, but could not win a prolonged war against American production. He was right about American production, but even Yamamoto, who knew America better than any Japanese military leader, underestimated the scale. The Japanese military philosophy emphasized spirit over material. Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that determination and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. Japanese troops were trained to endure hardship, to fight on empty stomachs, to consider suffering as proof of dedication. This philosophy had served Japan well in its conflicts with China and Russia. Japanese troops had won battles while outnumbered and outgunned through sheer determination and willingness to accept casualties. Against America, this philosophy became a fatal weakness. Because America didn't just have more weapons, America had redefined what military logistics meant. They had industrialized comfort, systematized morale, mass-produced luxury. The contrast was visible in the most basic metric: food.
Japanese military rations in 1941 consisted of rice, pickled vegetables, and small amounts of fish or meat. Daily caloric intake for Japanese soldiers was approximately 2,000 calories, barely sufficient for combat operations. As the war progressed and supply lines were disrupted, rations decreased. By 1945, Japanese soldiers in the Philippines were receiving 800 calories daily when they received anything at all. American military rations in 1941 provided 4,000 calories daily. This wasn't just quantity, it was variety. C rations included meat, vegetables, fruit, crackers, candy, and cigarettes. K rations provided chocolate bars, cheese, and instant coffee. And beyond basic rations, American forces had access to fresh food, hot meals, and yes, ice cream. The ice cream obsession began long before the war. Americans consumed more ice cream per capita than any nation on Earth. In 1941, American annual ice cream consumption was 17 pounds per person. In Japan, ice cream was a rare luxury that most citizens had never tasted. When America entered the war, military planners recognized that morale mattered. Comfortable, well-fed troops fought better than hungry, miserable ones. This wasn't weakness, it was strategic calculation. The U.S. Navy in particular understood that sailors on long deployments needed morale boosters. Ships began carrying ice cream makers as standard equipment. Larger vessels had ice cream parlors. Submarines operating in tropical waters for months at a time considered ice cream essential for crew morale. But the demand quickly exceeded capacity. By 1943, with hundreds of ships operating across the Pacific, traditional ice cream production couldn't keep up. So America did what it always did when faced with a logistics problem. It industrialized the solution. The concept was simple. Build dedicated ice cream production ships. Station them at major fleet anchorages. Let them produce ice cream continuously, distributing it to warships as they came into port. The execution was typically American, audacious, expensive, and effective. The first ice cream barge was commissioned in 1943. It wasn't a converted cargo ship or modified tanker. It was purpose-built from concrete, a material in abundant supply with refrigeration equipment, mixing machinery, and storage capacity for the ingredients needed to produce thousands of gallons weekly. The specifications were impressive for what was essentially a floating dessert factory. Length 110 feet, displacement 380 tons, crew 12 sailors, refrigeration capacity sufficient to maintain temperatures of -10 degrees Fahrenheit, production capacity 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, daily output over 2,000 gallons in continuous operation, storage 2,000 gallons of finished product. The barges required steady supplies of milk powder, sugar, cream, flavoring, and stabilizers. This supply chain stretched back thousands of miles to American farms and factories. Milk was powdered in Wisconsin, shipped across the continent to California ports, loaded onto cargo vessels, transported across the Pacific, and delivered to ice cream barges where it was reconstituted and transformed into frozen dessert. The logistics were mind-boggling, but to America in 1943, this was routine. Japanese intelligence first learned about the ice cream barges from captured documents in late 1943. The initial reports were dismissed as propaganda. No military would dedicate ships and resources to ice cream production during total war. It was absurd. But as more reports accumulated from reconnaissance, from captured sailors, from decoded communications, Japanese naval intelligence had to accept the impossible truth. The Americans had ice cream ships. Lieutenant Commander Toshiro Yamada, serving in the Naval Intelligence Section in Tokyo, wrote in his diary in January 1944, "Received confirmed reports of American ice cream production vessels. Initially believed this was disinformation. Multiple sources now verify. The Americans have constructed ships for no purpose except making frozen desserts. They have refrigerated the ocean. This is not a military we can defeat. This is industrial capacity beyond comprehension." The ice cream barges became operational across the Pacific. One stationed at Ulithi Atoll served the massive fleet anchorage there. Another operated from Pearl Harbor. A third was positioned at Manus in the Admiralty Islands. Eventually, barges were deployed to Manila, Guam, and other major fleet bases. Their operation was continuous. Ingredients arrived on cargo vessels. Production ran around the clock. When warships came into port for resupply and maintenance, ice cream was distributed along with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. For American sailors, ice cream had become as routine as mail call. For Japanese observers, it represented something terrifying. The ice cream barges weren't the only source. American innovation in mobile ice cream production extended to ships themselves. Aircraft carriers incorporated ice cream production into their galleys. The USS Lexington, commissioned in 1943, could produce 500 gallons of ice cream daily for its crew of over 3,000 men. The ice cream parlor aboard the Lexington became famous throughout the fleet, serving multiple flavors and operating during all hours. Destroyers and cruisers carried smaller ice cream makers. Submarines, where space was at an absolute premium, still found room for ice cream production equipment. The USS Pampanito, the Balao-class submarine, maintained an ice cream maker that produced small batches for the crew during long patrols. Even more remarkably, submarines developed a unique ice cream distribution system. When multiple submarines rendezvoused at sea, they would tie up alongside each other and exchange ice cream flavors. This ice cream social became a tradition that boosted morale during dangerous patrols. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, understood the strategic value of ice cream. He later wrote, "Ice cream was more important to morale than medals. A sailor who knew he could get ice cream after a combat mission fought with the confidence that his nation cared about his comfort. This wasn't waste, it was investment in combat effectiveness." But ice cream production created an unexpected problem: inequality between services. Navy personnel had regular access to ice cream. Marines fighting on Pacific Islands did not. Army soldiers in jungle warfare had no ice cream production capacity. This disparity created jealousy and resentment. The solution was typically American: build more capacity. Mobile ice cream units were designed for forward deployment. These trailer-mounted production systems could be transported by landing craft and set up on beachheads. By late 1944, Marines invading Pacific Islands could expect ice cream within 48 hours of securing the beach. The logistics required to deliver ice cream to combat zones exceeded what most nations allocated to ammunition supply. Refrigerated cargo vessels transported milk powder and cream across thousands of miles of ocean. Supply clerks tracked ice cream ingredients with the same meticulous care as artillery shells. Transportation priorities ensured ice cream supplies reached forward areas regularly. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to feed its troops at all. The contrast was nowhere more stark than in the Philippines campaign of 1944-45.
As American forces liberated the Philippines, Japanese defenders were starving. Cut off from supply by American submarines and aircraft, Japanese soldiers resorted to eating grass, tree bark, and anything remotely digestible. Diseases caused by malnutrition ravaged Japanese units. Commanders reported that soldiers lacked the strength to dig proper defensive positions. American forces fighting these same battles ate regular hot meals, received candy bars and cigarettes, and yes, enjoyed ice cream when available. Captured Japanese soldiers were consistently shocked by American rations. The food provided to prisoners exceeded what Japanese soldiers had eaten as free men. Many gained weight in American captivity. Private First Class Kenji Matsumoto, captured on Luzon in February 1945, later recalled, "I weighed 45 kilograms when captured. I could not walk without assistance. The Americans gave me soup, then bread, then rice. Within 1 week, I had eaten more than in the previous month. They offered me ice cream. I had never tasted it before. It was sweeter than anything I imagined. I asked if this was special food for prisoners. The American guard laughed and said this was normal food. I realized then that we had never understood what we fought against." The psychological impact of American abundance extended beyond captured soldiers to Japanese civilians. Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as decadent and weak, unable to withstand the hardships of war. But as Japanese cities were bombed and food supplies dwindled, civilians heard stories from returning soldiers about American plenty. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could a weak, decadent nation produce such abundance? How could their supposedly superior spirit lose to American materialism? Japanese military leadership had no answers. They had built a military philosophy around sacrifice and austerity. Facing an enemy who considered comfort a tactical advantage broke their conceptual framework. The ice cream ships became symbolic of this gap. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in 1945, received intelligence reports about American ice cream production. His response, recorded in staff meeting minutes, was telling. "The Americans make ice cream on ships, while our sailors receive half rations. This is not a difference in resources alone. This represents a different understanding of war. They fight to preserve their way of life. We fight to prove our spirit. Their way is winning." But ice cream was just one element of American logistic superiority. The broader system was even more overwhelming. American supply ships brought not just military necessities, but luxuries Japanese forces never imagined. Coca-Cola was manufactured on mobile bottling ships and distributed throughout the Pacific. The Coca-Cola Company sent representatives to war zones specifically to ensure frontline troops had access to their product. By war's end, American forces had established 64 bottling plants around the world, including several in the Pacific Theater. Japanese soldiers who had never tasted carbonated beverages before the war found themselves facing enemies who casually consumed soft drinks in combat zones. Beer was available in American military clubs, including those established on recently captured islands. The post-exchange system sold candy, cigarettes, magazines, and toiletries. Ships carried libraries with thousands of books. Entertainment troops performed for soldiers at forward bases. The Japanese military offered none of this. Japanese soldiers wrote letters home on whatever scraps of paper they could find. They smoked whatever tobacco was available, if any. Entertainment consisted of patriotic lectures. Reading material was restricted to military bulletins and propaganda. The disparity wasn't just comfort, it was respect. American military leadership treated soldiers as valuable assets worth preserving and maintaining. Morale, health, and mental well-being were considered essential to combat effectiveness. Money was spent freely on anything that kept troops fighting effectively. Japanese military leadership treated soldiers as expendable. The expectation was that warriors would endure any hardship without complaint. Requesting better food or conditions was considered shameful. Death was preferable to the disgrace of surrender or complaint. This philosophical difference had strategic consequences. American units maintained combat effectiveness longer because well-fed, well-rested troops fought better. American wounded received better medical care, returned to duty faster, and suffered lower mortality rates. American morale remained high even during difficult campaigns because soldiers knew they were valued. Japanese units degraded rapidly under stress because hungry, exhausted troops couldn't maintain peak performance. Japanese wounded often died from treatable conditions due to lack of medical supplies and poor nutrition. Japanese morale collapsed when Japanese soldiers realized they were considered expendable. The ice cream ships were the most visible symbol of this systemic difference. By 1945, the ice cream barge stationed in Manila Bay was producing over 2,000 gallons daily. This one vessel, serving no military purpose except morale, represented more industrial capacity than entire Japanese supply networks. The ingredients alone told the story. The Manila barge consumed weekly 2,000 pounds of milk powder shipped from Wisconsin, 800 pounds of sugar from Hawaii, 500 pounds of stabilizers manufactured in California, 400 pounds of flavoring extracts from various sources, plus water purification chemicals, refrigerants, and other supplies. This one ship making ice cream had a supply chain that stretched across the Pacific and back to the American mainland. Every ingredient was tracked, shipped, and delivered with the same efficiency as ammunition or fuel. Japan, by contrast, struggled to deliver rice to frontline units.
The submarine blockade had severed Japanese supply lines. Cargo vessels were sunk faster than replacements could be built. Fuel shortages meant remaining ships sat in port. Food stockpiles in Japan dwindled as the blockade tightened. By summer 1945, Japanese civilians were on starvation rations. Military units defending the home islands had adequate ammunition. They expected a final apocalyptic battle, but food supplies were critically low. Meanwhile, American forces preparing for the invasion of Japan were supplied with full rations plus luxuries. The invasion fleet included ice cream barges among the auxiliary vessels. The invasion never came. Atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war ended the conflict in August 1945. But for Japanese military leaders who surrendered, the ice cream ships remained seared in memory as symbols of American superiority. When Japanese officers were transported to surrender ceremonies aboard American flagships, they passed ice cream service windows. When Japanese diplomats came aboard USS Missouri for the formal surrender on September 2, 1945, American sailors were eating ice cream on deck. The message was inescapable. America had won so decisively that its warriors enjoyed frozen desserts while accepting enemy surrender. Mamoru Shigemitsu, Foreign Minister of Japan who signed the surrender documents aboard Missouri, later wrote, "We surrendered to a nation whose sailors ate ice cream on the decks of battleships. They had conquered us and yet seemed unburdened by war. They had fought across 2 oceans and yet maintained abundance. We had believed spirit would overcome material. We were wrong. Their material advantage was so vast that they could afford luxuries we could not imagine. This was not a military defeat alone. It was the defeat of our entire philosophy." The ice cream ships continued operating after the war ended. American occupation forces in Japan received ice cream regularly. Starving Japanese civilians saw American soldiers eating frozen desserts while they struggled to find rice. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese citizens who had been told they were a superior people confronted daily evidence of American abundance. The occupiers weren't cruel conquerors. They were often generous, sharing food with Japanese children. But that generosity came from such vast surplus that it made Japanese wartime sacrifices seem futile. The ice cream question became symbolic. Why had Japan sacrificed so much for a war it could never win? Post-war analysis by Japanese military historians consistently cited logistics as the decisive factor. Japan had won tactical victories, Pearl Harbor, the early conquests, countless individual battles where Japanese skill and courage prevailed. But tactics couldn't overcome the systemic advantage of American production. The numbers told an irrefutable story. In 1944, at the height of wartime production, American ice cream production 120 million gallons annually, with significant portions allocated to military. Japanese ice cream production, essentially zero for military purposes. American military food budget, sufficient to provide 4,000 calories daily per soldier, plus luxuries. Japanese military food budget, insufficient to prevent malnutrition in frontline units. American cargo vessels transporting ice cream ingredients, dozens. Japanese cargo vessels available for food transport, constantly decreasing due to submarine warfare. The ice cream ships represented something deeper than dessert. They represented a nation whose industrial base was so vast, whose agricultural production was so abundant, whose transportation network was so efficient that it could allocate resources to morale-boosting luxuries during total war. Japan had no equivalent. Japanese industrial production focused entirely on weapons. Every resource was allocated to combat capability. Soldiers were expected to endure hardship as proof of dedication. Victory would come through sacrifice. America sought military victory through overwhelming material advantage and superior logistics. Resources were allocated to maintain peak combat effectiveness. Soldiers were kept comfortable because comfortable troops fought better. Victory would come through production. History proved the American approach correct, but the lesson was learned at terrible cost. Japanese military casualties in the Pacific War exceeded 2 million. Many died not from combat, but from disease and starvation caused by logistic failure. Units cut off from supply resorted to cannibalism. Soldiers starved within sight of ocean full of fish because they lacked boats or nets. American military casualties in the Pacific were roughly 160,000 killed. While American troops certainly suffered hardship, combat is always terrible. They did so while supported by the most effective logistics system ever created. The ice cream ships were maintained after the war ended and served during the Korean conflict. By the late 1950s, improved refrigeration technology on regular vessels made dedicated ice cream barges unnecessary. They were decommissioned, but their legacy remained.
American military logistics continued to prioritize soldier comfort. Modern American bases worldwide have amenities that would seem impossible to earlier generations. Air conditioning, internet, gyms, restaurants offering multiple cuisines. This isn't decadence, it's strategic calculation that comfortable troops fight more effectively. The lessons learned from ice cream ships influenced military planning permanently. Morale matters. Logistics wins wars. Industrial capacity is strategic power. Abundance is strength. For Japan, the memory of ice cream ships became a teaching tool. Post-war Japanese military education emphasized that material capacity matters more than fighting spirit. Modern Japanese defense planning focuses heavily on logistics and sustainability. The ice cream barge in Manila Bay, where Captain Tanaka stood in July 1945, operated until 1946 before being decommissioned. No records indicate what became of the vessel. It was likely scrapped or scuttled as surplus property. But the story survived. Veterans told it. Historians documented it. It became symbolic of America's unique approach to warfare. In 2005, the Naval History and Heritage Command published oral histories with Pacific War veterans. Many mentioned ice cream. One account stood out. Radio Man Second Class James Morrison, who served aboard USS Enterprise, recalled, "We'd come back from a mission, having lost guys, having seen terrible things, and there'd be ice cream. Someone decided Americans needed ice cream to cope with war. That decision, that allocation of resources to something frivolous, proved we were going to win. Nations that can spare resources for ice cream during total war have already won. The fighting is just working out details." This perspective, that ice cream revealed inevitable victory, was widespread among American servicemen. They understood that a nation providing frozen desserts to frontline troops possessed power beyond measurement. Japanese veterans understood it too. Interviews conducted decades after the war consistently showed that Japanese survivors remembered American abundance with awe. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top fighter aces who survived the war, was asked in 1985 what surprised him most about Americans. His answer, ice cream. "You had ice cream on aircraft carriers. We knew you had more planes, more ships, more everything. But ice cream showed you had more than we could calculate. You had so much excess that you allocated resources to luxury during war. That's when I understood we had lost before the first shot. You weren't fighting for survival. You were fighting while maintaining your quality of life. That's the power of true abundance." The ice cream ships became legend. Stories circulated of concrete barges pumping out gallons per minute, of submarines sharing flavors at mid-ocean rendezvous, of Marines getting vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry within days of securing beachheads. Some stories were exaggerated, but the core truth remained. America had industrialized comfort during history's largest war. The broader implications extended beyond military history. The ice cream ships revealed how industrial democracies fight wars differently than authoritarian states. Democracies must maintain support from citizens who expect government to protect their quality of life. Democratic leaders who drastically reduce living standards risk losing power. Therefore, democratic war efforts try to minimize sacrifice. Authoritarian states can impose unlimited sacrifice because citizens have no mechanism to object. Leaders demanding extreme hardship face no consequences. Therefore, authoritarian war efforts assume sacrifice as default. America's ice cream ships represented democratic warfare, maintaining abundance even during total war. Japan's starving soldiers represented authoritarian warfare, accepting unlimited sacrifice without question. The democratic approach won, not because democracy is morally superior, though that's arguable, but because maintaining quality of life produces better combat results than imposed sacrifice. Well-fed, comfortable troops fight harder and longer than starving, miserable troops. Democratic militaries that keep soldiers comfortable maintain effectiveness. Authoritarian militaries that demand sacrifice face degrading performance. The ice cream ships proved this principle in the most unlikely way, through frozen desserts. Modern military forces understand this lesson. American bases worldwide maintain amenities that earlier generations would consider impossible. This isn't waste, it's strategic investment in combat effectiveness. The legacy continues. In 2003, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, American forces established ice cream facilities in forward bases within weeks. In Afghanistan, troops at remote outposts received ice cream deliveries via helicopter. Critics sometimes call this waste. Military leadership disagrees. Data shows that quality of life improvements reduce stress, improve retention, and maintain combat effectiveness. Ice cream remains strategic. The Japanese commanders who encountered American ice cream production in 1945 had their worldview shattered. They had believed Bushido, warrior spirit, would overcome material disadvantage. They had assumed Japanese willingness to sacrifice would defeat American comfort-seeking. The ice cream ships proved them wrong. America won not despite providing luxuries, but because providing luxuries maintained combat effectiveness. the nation that could allocate resources to frozen desserts during total war, had already won. The fighting was just formality. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, who stood on that ice cream barge in Manila Bay in July 1945, survived the war. He returned to Japan during occupation, witnessed American abundance firsthand, and later became a professor of military history. In his lectures, he frequently mentioned the ice cream ships. Students sometimes laughed, assuming he was joking. He would shake his head seriously. "I am not joking. The Americans built ships just for making ice cream. Multiple ships. They operated them throughout the war. This single fact tells you everything about why Japan lost. We counted bullets, they made ice cream. We demanded sacrifice, they provided luxury. We thought spirit would win, material won. The ice cream ships were the most important vessels in the Pacific. They proved we had already lost before the first battle." The ice cream barges were decommissioned, dismantled, and forgotten by most Americans. To them, ice cream during war was normal. Of course troops got ice cream. Why wouldn't they? But to Japanese observers, the ice cream ships revealed a truth about American power that numbers alone couldn't capture. This wasn't just industrial capacity. This was a civilization whose productive power was so vast that it could treat luxuries as necessities during total war. The mathematics were simple. 10 gallons every 7 minutes, thousands of gallons weekly, distributed across fleets, consumed by hundreds of thousands of sailors and soldiers who considered it routine. Each gallon represented supply chains stretching across continents and oceans. Each serving symbolized American abundance that Japan could never match. The ice cream ships won no battles. They sank no enemy vessels. They killed no enemy soldiers. But they won the war as surely as any battleship or bomber. They proved that America's power was not just in weapons, but in the ability to maintain civilization during apocalypse. They showed that American sailors fought not as desperate warriors making final sacrifices, but as confident professionals who expected ice cream after combat. They demonstrated that the United States was waging a different kind of war, one where victory was inevitable because the nation could afford to make ice cream while conquering the Pacific. Japanese commanders couldn't believe America had entire ships just for making ice cream, but they learned to believe it. They had no choice. The evidence floated in Manila Bay, producing 10 gallons every 7 minutes, serving the fleet that had destroyed Japanese naval power, symbol of abundance that could not be defeated. The war ended with ice cream ships still operating. They served dessert while Japan signed surrender documents. They continued production during occupation. They proved that American victory was total, militarily, industrially, and philosophically. In the end, the ice cream ships taught the lesson that Japanese military planners should have learned before Pearl Harbor. Never fight a war against a nation that can make ice cream on warships while conquering the world. That power, the power to maintain luxury during apocalypse, is the power of inevitable victory. The Japanese commanders learned this truth too late. The ice cream ships had already proven it. The war was lost before the first shot. The fighting was just working out details. America had ice cream, Japan had spirit. Ice cream won.